Adam and Hoss Cartwright were opposites. Adam the thoughtful, reserved architect, Hoss the gentle giant with a ready smile. That contrast worked brilliantly on TV, and it reflected the actors behind the roles, Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker. Off-camera, however, their lives and choices were more complicated. Then everything changed. Dan Blocker died suddenly at 43, and one familiar face was absent from the funeral. Pernell Roberts. Was it bitterness, private grief, or something else? Today's video peels back that mystery. To viewers, Dan Blocker was Hoss, warm, funny, and impossible not to like. Off-screen he was even more modest, uninterested in celebrity, devoted to his wife and children. He avoided parties and press, treating fame as a job, not a lifestyle. By 1970, worried about his family growing up in the spotlight, he moved them to a quiet Swiss lakeside town. No fanfare, no autographs, just normal life. In 1972, a routine gallbladder operation ended in a fatal pulmonary embolism. The sudden loss shocked Hollywood and the show's cast. Michael Landon later admitted the grief reshaped his performances. For the rest of the crew, it was like losing a brother. Bonanza's producers faced an unprecedented choice: recast Hoss, ignore his death, or confront it. They chose truth and respect. Hoss would die on the show. It was the first time a major American series openly acknowledged a character's on-screen death because the actor had died. The episode opened with quiet, raw grief. No neat explanation, just the weight of loss. From that point, Bonanza felt different. Not because a role vanished, but because a piece of its heart was gone. Pernell Roberts' absence at the funeral ignited rumors. Some said he'd soured on the show, criticized scripts, or left under a cloud. The fuller picture is more personal. Pernell had walked away after 6 seasons because he disliked the scripts and wanted to address social issues the show avoided. He was private, uncomfortable with spectacle, and loathed intrusive press. A funeral full of cameras was probably unbearable. Pernell never disparaged Dan publicly. He later spoke of him with respect. For Pernell, silence may have been his way to grieve. False stories circulated. The most sensational claimed Dan was buried in a piano case because of his size. It was untrue. He was laid to rest in DeKalb, Texas, beside family. The rumor only showed how larger-than-life he'd become in the public imagination. Their origins and careers could not have been more different. Pernell earned his chops on stage and in serious drama. Shakespeare, Broadway, awards, and a reputation for layered intellectual performances. He had trained to dig into character and wanted roles with depth and social relevance. Dan came to acting from a rougher route. A Korean War infantry sergeant and Purple Heart recipient, his life had known danger and humility. He steadily built a TV career with small but memorable Western roles that showcased a sturdy, tender presence. He wasn't flashy, just genuine, dependable, and quietly funny. Qualities that made him perfect for Hoss. When David Dortort created Bonanza, he wanted a Western about family and moral choices, not just gunfights. He needed actors who could be themselves and yet form a believable clan. Pernell offered intelligence and gravitas for Adam. Dan brought warmth and heart for Hoss. Together they helped turn Bonanza into something different. A show about values and family in the Old West. Looking back, the story isn't a simple feud or a scandal. It's about 2 men shaped by different ambitions and temperaments. A stage-trained perfectionist who prized privacy and principled choices, and a gentle private family man who shunned fame. Dan's death exposed how deeply both men cared for what mattered most to them: family, integrity, and the lives they led beyond the cameras. If Pernell's farewell was absence, it was not necessarily disrespect. It was a boundary, a private grief in a world that demanded public mourning. And in that silence, the Ponderosa's loss felt, and still feels, impossibly large. Adam and Hoss were opposites on screen. Adam, the thoughtful, reserved architect. Hoss, the gentle giant with a ready smile. Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker were just as different off-camera. One a stage-trained perfectionist, the other a humble family man, and their contrast helped make Bonanza unforgettable. Off-screen, Dan was quietly the sort of man who defied the easy headlines. He treated fame like a briefcase he opened for work and closed when his shift was done. At home he was ordinary, a father who helped with homework, a husband who cooked on slow Sunday afternoons, a neighbor who waved as he walked the dog through the alpine air of a village he chose because it offered privacy and peace. Moving his family to a small Swiss town wasn't a publicity stunt. It was a deliberate, unglamorous act of protection. He wanted to shield the people he loved from the fusillade of bright lights that had defined his public life. For him, being on television was a job with a schedule and a paycheck, not the definition of who he was. That modesty became painfully relevant in 1972. What began as a routine gallbladder operation turned catastrophic when a pulmonary embolism struck. The death came like an impossible edit. Abrupt, disorienting, final. For viewers who had watched Hoss laugh or stumble or open his heart on screen for more than a decade, it felt as if someone had pulled a beam out from under the set. Within the tight web of the cast, crew, and writers, it was worse. A friend and colleague was gone. Michael Landon later admitted the loss reshaped his approach to performing. Grief sharpened his sense of what it meant to inhabit a character with honesty and vulnerability. The whole show felt altered, and the production team suddenly faced a problem most series never confront. What do you do when an actor dies in the middle of a running series? Producers had three messy, imperfect choices. They could recast the part and hope audiences accepted a different face behind the familiar lines. They could pretend the episode in which the actor appeared never happened and write around the absence. Or they could allow the reality of death to enter the fictional world. They chose the last, braver path. Hoss would die on the show. It was the first time a major series acknowledged an actor's death by killing the character. A bold, humane move that refused to sanitize or hide the hurt. The episode opened with a quiet that the show had never known before. Not the plum voiceover or the jaunty music, but silence heavy with raw grief. Cameras lingered on small things. A folded shirt, a chair left empty, a child's lack of understanding. The grief was real and, because it was real, it changed how audiences watched. From that moment, Bonanza no longer felt like an escapist western only. It became a place where life's unpredictability was permitted to exist on screen. Rumors and gossip attempted to fill the hole left by his absence. One particularly grotesque myth, that Dan had been buried in a piano case because of his size, circulated with a sort of macabre enthusiasm that only rumor mills can produce. It is untrue. He was laid to rest in DeKalb, Texas, near family, in the quiet place he would have wanted. The persistence of the myth said something ugly and revealing about celebrity. When public affection grows large enough, fiction will try to claim reality, and the more implausible the lie, the more it says about people's hunger to own a story. Pernell's absence at the funeral became another source of speculation and, for some, a sign of discord. The truth was simpler and softer. Pernell had left the show after 6 seasons because it no longer served what he wanted to do as an artist. He came from the theater, where roles could be interrogated by the intellect and used to challenge social assumptions. He had wanted scripts that grappled with the era's pressing issues. Not every Western could be coaxed into that service. A private man by nature, he disliked spectacle and the invasive curiosity of the press. A public funeral crowded with cameras and questions would have felt like a violation of the boundaries he had worked to maintain all his life. He never publicly disparaged Dan. When he spoke of him in later years, it was with a careful respect. His silence at the graveside can be read not as coldness but as the maintenance of a personal line, a boundary that, for him, preserved dignity. Their differences help explain the creative alchemy that made the show more than a portrait of the Old West. Pernell, theatrical, exacting, hungry for depth, brought an inner life to Adam that asked questions the show did not always know how to answer. Dan, with the directness of a man shaped by service and an instinctive warmth, gave Hoss a generosity that made viewers feel safer. He had been a war veteran, a man who had seen blunt realities and responded to them with simple compassion. Where Pernell's Adam offered conscience and argument, Dan's Hoss offered forgiveness and comfort. The series needed both, the conscience to question and the heart to soothe. David Dortort recognized this and assembled them knowing the contrast would make the Cartwright family feel whole. On set their temperaments sometimes collided. Pernell could be exacting, insisting on authenticity and depth from scripts that often preferred action to introspection. Dan was affable and willing to find the comic beat in a scene. He kept morale warm when schedules were brutal. They were not close friends in the private sense, but there was a professional respect that allowed them to play off one another in ways that felt effortless on camera. Their dynamic, mind and heart, became the show's moral engine. When Pernell left, the show lost a voice that challenged it to grow. When Dan died, it lost the kind of soul viewers recognized as kin. Outside the frame, Dan pursued ventures that reflected both his entrepreneurial spirit and his desire for connection. He invested in projects related to the show's brand and continued to take film roles that allowed him to stretch beyond the ranch. He was loyal to the role of Hoss not out of an inability to move on, but because the part connected him to people who mattered. He treated the character as an avenue to do small acts of kindness, public and private. That loyalty contrasted with Pernell's insistence on artistic principle, the need sometimes to walk away in order to remain true to oneself. Both choices are legible and admirable in their way. Pernell's departure exemplifies moral courage. He walked from comfort to keep faith with his artistic ambitions. Dan's decision to stay, to root himself in a role that brought joy to millions, shows a different sort of courage, the kind that chooses constancy and service over restless reinvention. When we argue about which was right, we miss the point. Their legacies are complementary, like notes in harmony. One clears space for difficult questions, the other affirms that tenderness matters. The death of Hoss on screen, the producer's decision to marry fiction to the painful truth of Dan's absence, offered another lesson. It insisted that grief is not a technical obstacle to be edited out, but a human condition that television can honor. The episode's quiet scenes taught viewers something about mourning, that it's made of small, ordinary moments rather than dramatic speeches, that sadness and affection can live in the same house. In a medium often accused of chasing spectacle, this was an act of humility. Maybe the most lasting tribute isn't choosing sides in their differing philosophies, but remembering the joy and the humanity they gave. Each man carried real, complicated lives behind the characters audiences loved. Histories of service and sacrifice, temperaments that could clash, choices made out of principle or love. Their story reminds us how porous the line is between public personas and private people. It asks us to resist easy judgments and to recognize boundaries as acts of preservation rather than slights. In the end, what endures is not the mythology or the gossip, but the image of a family who gathered and argued and comforted one another in the face of loss, and of two actors who, in their very different ways, taught millions of viewers to be better neighbors in the small, daily sense. Fame fades. What remains are the choices we make about how to treat one another when the cameras are off. That lesson, quiet, stubborn, human, is perhaps the most inspiring legacy either man could have hoped to leave.